Right, we are recording, I think.
How sinister.
Okay. Should we start? Should we think about starting? Oh my god. Okay. I'm really nervous. So just for anyone who joined after we kind of talked about this, so there is one story that is the story that I kind of finished this week, which was the one that I was like, oh, I would like to read that for Storytime Sunday. So I'm going to read that one. I've also written another one this afternoon. Like I kind of I had an idea for a story, and I thought, oh, this is a really cute, exciting idea. I'm going to go out for a walk and think about it and see if I can flesh it out. And while I was out on the walk, I had another completely different idea and got obsessed with that, came back, sat down and wrote it, and sort of finished it. I think it reads like I've just written it in 3 hours, but I would maybe like to read that one as well if people would be up for it.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Read the first one and see how everyone's feeling and see where we're at time-wise.
Frankie, in what world do you think we're going to say no to another?
Particularly stories that you've written. I think everyone wants to hear what you've written.
Just wants to give herself an out.
Especially after listening to your poetry yesterday. Give me more.
No. Right, I'm going to mute you all. I'm muting you all.
I need to hold up signs saying, yes, we want your stories.
Okay, if I can figure out how to mute you all, I will. Bear with me. I'm all of a tibber. Okay, I'm muting you all. Yeah.
You've muted yourself.
Thank you, Zach.
Unmute the other one.
Right. That's fine now. God, I'm not good at this. Okay. Take 2. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. So this is called, tentatively, Full. The moon walked along the shore of the sea, dragging her long silvery hair behind her like a chain. She walked slowly, pebbles and empty shells crunching beneath her narrow feet, crouching here and there to probe amongst the rocks with long, pointed hands. She was naked and very thin and very, very hungry. She was searching for oysters. When she found one, she chipped it painstakingly from the rock, but though her hands' lancing points were very sharp, they were unsuited to the task of holding and shucking her prize. The best she could manage was to pierce the flat top shell and suck out the gritty brine, lapping gingerly at the rough surface like a cat. Sometimes the curving, irregular shards made little cuts on her tongue, their edges so sharp she didn't realize she was bleeding until she tasted copper mingled with the oyster's clean mineral tang. On calm, still nights, she wandered out across the surface of the water until the shifting swells shattered her mirrored path. On others, she walked in the opposite direction, up the beach, feeling the wet, shifting sand firm and steady beneath her feet until the last glimmering reflections gave out and she could go no further. Sometimes she wondered whether there were other moons that trod the surface of lakes and ponds, who came to the rain-slicked, shining surfaces of playgrounds and car parks, only to evaporate with the first stroking warmth of the sun. Was she the moon, or only the moon of this shore? Did it matter? If she were the only moon, then she was alone. If there were others, then she was also alone. At times, the idea of other moons seemed like a comfort. At others, the thought woke an ache in her belly that was more unbearable than her constant, ravening hunger. Tonight the sea was restless, a light breeze chopping the surface and raising frills of foam across the shallows. The moon shivered a little as she picked her way between the rock pools. The next stretch of sand yielded another oyster, half buried, which emerged with a wet sucking sound as she manoeuvred her hand beneath its edge and levered it out. She settled it in a crevice between two stones and managed to pierce it more neatly than usual, only a few drops of brine spilling onto the rocks. It was as she was bending to lap at the cracked, pitted shell that she felt the unmistakable brush of observation against her thin shoulders. The sun is an eye whose gaze cannot be returned. Safe from casual regard, it only looks and cannot be looked at. Its stare is impartial, unself-conscious. The moon, though, the moon knows about being watched. She looked along the deserted beach and then, turning to the open water, met a pair of dark eyes, as soft and wet as sea anemones. The seal had a quizzical, comical puss mouth, fringed with fine, long whiskers. He looked as though he were smiling, or perhaps laughing at her, but the moon found that she did not mind somehow. For a few moments they regarded each other as he bobbed in the waves. Between them the sea lapped and patted gently at the dark sand as though making friends with it. Then the moon bent her head back to her meagre meal, her tangled hair falling forward around her face in a silver veil. She felt a little embarrassed, though she could not quite think why. Perhaps it was simply the weight of scrutiny, steady upon her as a touch. When she had finished, she stood, leaving the remains of the oyster with its barely touched meat behind, and continued picking her way along the strand. By the time she found another, the feeling of being watched had disappeared. This one was more difficult to prise free, rooted deeply into the fissure of a cracked boulder and spackled over with barnacles. It took several minutes of effort to loosen, and when she succeeded, it teetered precariously before she managed to steady it. As she straightened, the craggy shell balanced safely between her hands. She felt the gaze upon her again, stronger than before. She looked up and found that the seal had swum closer, twisting through the shallows towards the place where the moon stood, the glistening snarl of her hair coiling away behind him. He was very close now. There was a colony of fur seals on a rocky islet further down the coast, and she had seen them at the shore from time to time. The odd pair of youngsters frolicking in the waves or chasing one another among the sandbanks. Occasionally they would look her way, but they had never come near her, more from lack of care than lack of courage, she thought. Now, though, this one was only feet away, his blackberry eyes fixed on her. He paused at the edge of the surf, then began to shuffle closer. Without thinking, she backed away. She was not afraid of him, but his proximity, his attention was unsettling. She was accustomed to being looked at, but as a mirror is looked at, with a kind of absent focus, as though looking not at, but through. The world is full of moon gazers, but it is not truly her face they are seeking. The seal stopped. Then he dropped his gaze to the oyster in her hands. The moon hesitated. She was so hungry. She was always so hungry. He gave no impression of eagerness. He looked patient, intent, as though he could wait all night, but he was unmistakably waiting. Finally, she stepped forward and placed her prize on a wide, flat rock that sat between them like an unlaid table. She didn't know what else to do. The seal surged forward. The moon wasn't sure what she'd been expecting, for him to worry it like a dog, perhaps, or seize it and dash off into the water. Instead, he cocked his head critically to the side, like an engineer inspecting a new bridge. His long whiskers looked so like a bristling officious moustache that the moon had to swallow a smile. He lowered his head, manoeuvred a little with his jaws open, then closed them gently around the blunt hinge of the oyster. For a moment, nothing seemed to be happening. Then there was a faint, muffled noise, a pop followed by the crunch-crack of shell. He repositioned his sharp canines and bit down again. A tiny lateral tug, surgically precise. Another, louder pop. Then he lifted his muzzle carefully away and shuffled backward. The moon stared. The oyster lay on the rock between them, its flat top shell aslant, showing a pale pearlescent curve that glimmered in her reflected light. There was no sound but the murmuring of the sea as it sighed and shifted. The dark, liquid eyes regarded her steadily. He showed no inclination to come forward again. Once more, she had the feeling that he was waiting for her. Cautiously, she approached the rock, realizing as she did so that she was holding her breath. The seal did not move. The moon reached out gingerly, holding the rounded base still with the point of one hand while she probed under the flat lid. An elastic resistance, then something gave way, and the shell slid open like a gift. The oyster inside was almost the same color as its pale, gleaming dish, rib-edged with black. Trembling with hunger and something else she could not quite name, the moon raised it to her mouth. Its flesh was slippery, firmer than she had expected, the flavor buttery and metallic. She was so ravenous she could hardly tell if it was good or not. It didn't matter. She chewed once, swallowed immediately, licked greedily at the shell until the last trace of brine was gone. Then she looked up. The seal was still watching her attentively. A long moment stretched between them. Then he swung his sleek bulk back towards the sea, his lolloping, rocking gait becoming a lithe flicker as he entered the water. The moon felt the weight of his gaze lift from her. Nevertheless, she stood watching the water for a long time after he had gone. When she rose the next night, he was at the shore again, reclining at his ease beside the same wide, flat rock as before. His brindled fur stuck up in wet points like the scales of a pine cone, and his flippers swept idly back and forth on the sand, for all the world as though he was waiting for her. Beside him was a small pile of oysters. Something in the moon's chest tightened rather painfully. She hung back for an instant, unsure, but when the seal saw her, he rolled upright, tossing his head in welcome and invitation. The moon was startled into laughter, delight rising inside her like a bubble. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the oysters onto the rock one by one, the seal leaning in to open each in turn with the same precise, methodical movements. She wondered vaguely how he had learned the trick, but could not spare too much thought to the question, or to anything beyond the alien delight of sustenance. Her appetite felt insatiable, each cool, silky mouthful only spurring on her eagerness for the next. When all the shells were empty and the seal turned to leave once more, she remained just as famished, though some hollow place inside her felt perhaps a little less empty than it had before. The night after that, the moon came to the shore a little earlier, her heart beating a little faster. When she saw him swimming towards her, the bud of hope in her heart put out 5 tiny petals, and much as she tried, she found she could not bring herself to pluck it out. He was dragging behind him a long matted rope of kelp, gnarled into elf locks and bearded with ribbed muscles, the shining blue-black of a raven's wing. He took these delicately between his teeth, one by one, and opened them for her like treasure chests. The coral of their meat glowed in the darkness. All night long they sat together, the seal nosing through the wide, thick ribbons to find every morsel. And by the time dawn began to dilute the dark, the moon found that hunger had loosened its teeth in her belly, just a little. The next night, he brought her a brace of sleek black-barred mackerel glistening like rainbows, their dark, oily meat rich and spicy as tar. She ate the first one far too fast. Its fine, fibrous bones stuck in her throat, and the seal gave a whiffling bark of amusement as she coughed and spluttered. She managed to hold back her appetite enough to offer him a share as well, but he only nosed it gently back towards her when she held out one of the fish to him. It seemed that this catch was intended only for her. The night after, there was a gamey hunk of shark, its flesh dense and musky, the ragged edges of its sandpaper skin cat's tongue rough against her own. Then, a long, thick strip of creamy blubber torn from the fresh carcass of a whale, cloud white and opaque, so quiveringly tender that it seemed barely able to hold its shape, melting into a luscious wash on her tongue. She began to allow herself to expect him, to anticipate his presence, to wonder what fresh treat would be in store without wondering if he would be there at all. He never disappointed her. Each night there was something new, each thing more delicious than the last. As her hunger ebbed from ravenous to merely peckish, his offerings became more delicate and she savoured them slowly. He brought her lucent, diaphanous squid, delicately tensile, their smooth hoods offering a supple resistance beneath her teeth. Jellyfish in an extravagant froth like a discarded wedding dress, hems beaded with crimson jewels. Once, several broad, perforated ears of abalone, which he cleaned with his tongue once she had eaten the tender meat, their iridescent, nacreous insides gleaming opaline in the moon's increasing light. As the days passed, her narrow hands widened, unfurling like fans into curved blades, and he helped her to cut off her chain of hair with them. Standing so close behind her, she could feel his warmth against her back and holding up the long, matted ropes to be sheared away. When they were gone, her head felt as though it would float free, the blunt silver strands fanning and glistening around her broadening face like thistledown. The seals seemed to be changing too. When he brought her a wild salmon, peony pink, striated with pale pinstripes of fat, he could not bite into it as before. Instead, he held the fish steady while the moon shaved off thin, gilt-edged ribbons with the sharp edge of her hand. Its sweet flesh was firm and cool, yielding to softness in her mouth. He had brought her samphire too, only the freshest and youngest green tips, and he rolled them up in the delicate pink slivers of salmon and fed them to her. His fingers left a constellation of silver scales across her lips, glittering like tiny sequins. His dark, glossy eyes never changed though, and each time she met them, the moon felt her heart open a little wider. One day she arrived to find him waiting for her with half a dozen oysters arranged in a semicircle on the sand, each craggy shell already open and nestled carefully in a heap of pebbles to keep it from spilling. When the moon saw them, she wrinkled her nose, remembering the thin, gritty brine of her hungry days, and marvelling inwardly at the luxurious novelty of being picky with her food. But the seal only laughed and led her to stand in the centre of the crescent, so that the glistening, irregular petals of their shells fanned out around her feet. Kneeling before her, he displayed his most exotic prize, a clutch of birds' eggs, tawny pistachio-coloured and speckled with chocolatey flecks. As he cracked each one carefully and separated it with his fingers, he told her how he had stolen them from the nest of a black-backed gull, climbing the slippery, vertiginous cliff and bringing them down, one by precious one, held safely in his mouth. He slid one globular marigold yolk into each shell, where it nestled cuckoo-like next to its pale host. The moon peered at them in astonishment. She had never seen anything so bright. When the seal brought the first shell to her lips, she felt that she was eating the sun, and herself beside it. The yolk burst on her tongue, flooding her mouth with a rich intensity of warmth that was almost painful. Then the oyster, not a wan imitation, but a subtle pendant, chaining and underpinning its opulence with a clean, savoury salinity. Her mouth immediately watered for another. With each mouthful, she grew brighter. Her face was as round and beautiful as a silver coin, and she glowed with an incandescence that made the night sky draw back in awe. The sea crept as close as it dared, reaching out with trembling fingers to brush at her feet. The seal stood before her, the wet glisten of his skin streaked with silver where her light touched him. He held her hands in his own, and she looked into his face and saw herself reflected in the soft, liquid darkness of his eyes. "Why," the moon cried in astonishment, "I am beautiful." He smiled gently, and she wondered to see the difference in those sharp, clever teeth. "You have always been beautiful. You could not be less than entirely beautiful, my darling. It is just that now there is more beauty because there is more you." She smiled back at him, helpless with love. "I think," she murmured as he drew closer to her, "I think that perhaps I am almost full." He brought the sweep of her hand to his mouth and kissed it, her knuckles, her palm, the inside of her wrist. "Almost, love?" She felt the brush of his whiskers, the delicate scrape of his teeth against her skin. She shivered. Perhaps just one more bite. One more mouthful." He was at her neck now. His soft laugh sent a puff of warmth across her throat. "Then you shall have one more mouthful." He took the last oyster from its bed and raised it to his own lips. Her light painted the line of his throat in a long, sweeping stroke of silver as he tipped it back. Then he took the moon's face in his hands and pressed his mouth to hers. She tasted the sweet sea tang of the brine as it trickled in, and she opened her lips beneath his so that the oyster could slip softly onto her tongue. She swallowed it and felt the last, tiniest shred of her eternal appetite dissipate. At last, at long last, she was full. She opened her eyes and smiled into his dark, adoring gaze. But something had changed. His eyes were not the same round, wet anemone eyes that she knew so well. Their shape was different, the brown irises smaller and rimmed with white. They were no longer the eyes of a seal, but those of a man, and they looked straight through her. The moon reeled back, stumbling on the sharp rocks and almost falling. The seal man did not move to help her, instead turning and gazing wildly about him with a dawning look of horror. He reached out his hands, though not towards her, where she crouched in bewilderment by the sea's edge. He called for her, first softly and then with increasing desperation, but no matter how many times she replied, he could not seem to hear her. He waded out thigh deep into the waves, but he was no longer at home in the sea. He returned to the shore and began to search frantically along it, crying out for her as though his heart would break. The moon let him go. She sat on the cold sand, dazed and numb, her glorious light falling about her like rain. She rose the next night in hopes that the change might be reversed, that the seal would be waiting for her again, his dark eyes aglow with love and reflections, eager to ply her with delicacies from the ocean. She still wasn't hungry, but felt that she could eat a little for the pleasure of it, and for the pleasure of taking it from his hand. That everything would be as it was. When she arrived at the shore, her heart leapt, for there he was, waiting for her. But he could not see her. And when she tried to touch him, her hands passed across his skin only as moonlight. There was a wide basket of food by his side, but it was land food, man food, thick red meat and coarse bread and rubbery, puckish grapes, and she did not want it. He raised his head and gazed at the sky with his strange new eyes, and she saw the silver tracks of tears on his cheeks. She sat down beside him on the sand and laid the silver fan of her hand beside his. She did not speak to him. She knew she could not bear to hear what he would not say in reply. She stayed beside him all night, and there was no sound but the wind that soughed through the coarse grasses beyond the beach. The next night was the same, and the next, and the next. At first she couldn't contemplate eating, too lost in misery to feel the tug of hunger in her belly. But even the most broken of hearts heal, and the moon is resilient for all her changes. She regained her appetite, but she had no way now to obtain the delicious treats the seal had scoured oceans to bring to her. There was once again nothing for her to eat but the beach's own oysters, which she shucked with the half blades of her hands. They tasted of tears. Though she ate as many as she could find, their paltry meat was not sufficient to sustain her, and she continued to diminish. Soon her hands thinned once more from blades to points, and she was no longer able to cut her hair, which lengthened and tangled about her shoulders, then her waist, then her ankles, snagging amongst the rough rocks and making her stumble. Every night she saw the sealman on the beach, searching for her, and every night her hunger grew until she thought it would choke her. Then came a calm, terrible night when even the breeze seemed to have abandoned the beach. The air was vacuum barren. The sea lay with the unnatural serenity of something dead. The moon wandered out across it, restless beneath the weight of so much stillness. She was so thin now, as thin as she had ever been, and her path stretched like a pale tightrope across the dark water. She walked out as far as she could, until the beach and the rocky headlands had receded to dim shadows between the deeper blacknesses of sea and sky, and there she stopped and looked about her. There was nothing, not a sound, not a movement. The whole world seemed void, with not a creature in it but her. Without warning, her loneliness slashed at her, a sudden lacerating pain that brought her to her knees. She looked down at the glassy surface of the water beneath her, and the sight brought a fresh shock. She had not seen her own face for days. She wondered now how she could ever have thought there might be other moons. It seemed to her that she herself was barely there at all. And the moon began to weep. She wept for the hollowness of her cheeks, for the gnawing pit in her stomach, for the emptiness of her heart, and she turned her face away. All that long night she hid her face from the world, from the sea and the beach and the strangeness of her lover, gazing out into the deeper, darker gulf of the heavens. And what she may have thought or said, or how long she may have wept, none may know but the stars, who love her and will not tell. Despair is a cauldron that boils, despite its cold. When hers had finally boiled dry, the moon felt raw and exhausted and thistledown light, her sparse bones washed clean. The weight of her melancholy was no less terrible, but she braided it into the chain of her hair and let it drag behind her as she returned once more to the shore. The breeze had returned with her. It skimmed gauzy ribbons along the sand at her feet. The sea shuffled and shushed to itself amongst the rocks. The sealman was not there. For a teetering instant, the moon felt the wind blow through her. Her faint underwater light swayed and rippled like a tattered banner. Then, slowly, she began to pick her way along the shore of the sea. Her hands were long and pointed. She was naked and very thin and very, very hungry. It seemed to take her a long time to find the first oyster. She supposed that she had lost the knack. The wind picked up as she began to pry it from the rock, blowing her streaming hair into a web of silver filaments. It licked at her shoulders, raising gooseflesh on her pale skin, and its chafe was so insistent that she did not immediately recognize the soft, skimming touch of observation. She whirled around. The oyster fell unheeded to the sand. He was there before her, so close she could reach out and touch him. Those dark, fathomless eyes gazed up at her, achingly familiar, their twin depths reflecting not one lone moon, but a pair, glowing side by side. For a long moment, he held them fixed and fervent on her thin face, as though it were not she alone whom their distance had been starving. The seal brushed his whiskered cheek against her pointed, trembling hand, just once. Then he lowered his sharp muzzle to the oyster and began to open it for her.
Wow.
Wow.
That was
Thank
so
you.
cracking.
That was so good.
I
You have
really
such a
liked that.
knack. You have a really good knack for writing stories. That was incredibly just beautiful.
Thank you.
That was insanely good.
Yeah.
You enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm really so glad there was a happy ending. I was really worried. Not least because obviously the seal is based on me with the big brown eyes.
How did you know? How did you know? I
mean,
about it.
I've called you out on it.
God damn it, Nix. We'll talk about this later.
I've told you to stop trying to seduce me in public. It's incredibly embarrassing.
And yet, here we are. Right, stop flirting. Stop flirting. That's not what I brought you here for.
You were lied to.
How are you not published? For real, that is a story that should be published.
Agreed.
It could easily be published. Yeah. Send it to Neil Gaiman. Like, get him to publish it. In an anthology. And special mention to.
Well, I am publishing it here and now. Here we go. It's gonna be published.
It's going to go viral on. It's going to go viral on YouTube.
So
much to that. Oh my God. Sorry. Yeah.
You're right, Gordon.
No, I need to listen to it again because there was like at least 3 or 4 layers to everything that I was listening. I'm like,
was there?
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
I'm glad you picked up on that. For one thing, she was hungry, but I don't know if you've noticed, she was also the moon and she became full.
My God, your critical analysis is just so incisive, you know?
Thanks.
It's because she lives in a library.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does explain it. That does explain it.
Well, what's the theory on why he was a seal?
Because
Selkies are assholes.
Because seals are the embodiments of dogs of the ocean versus the land, and the ocean is known as the
doghouse of the sea.
No, I was not going to go for that. I was going to go for the I've forgotten the word, but a bountiful source of food.
Yeah, like a flipping bread basket or whatever.
Exactly, and dogs play fetch, so this seal is fetching instead of sticks. It's fetching food.
Honestly, I just think they're a little bit like spooky and otherworldly, and I needed somebody who would like feed the moon until she was full.
Yeah, plus they're slippery, so when he disappears.
I feel like selkies are this islands. The islands.
My searing analysis.
Your seal ring analysis. Moving on from that.
I've broken this story wide open.
You're not invited back. Block. Mute. Block.
I've outstayed my welcome.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to my story. That was. I really enjoyed telling it. And yeah, like big kudos to Zach, who made me and Ainsley very hungry with his descriptions of the seafood he was going to eat this summer, like in a conversation a month ago, and I was like, I gotta write about some seafood, and then wrote a bunch of descriptions of seafood and found a story to hang kind of loosely around it.
Can you see the chat right now?
I can't. What's happening in the chat?
Oh, Tara just mentioned that her favorite bit is that he's like a reverse wear seal. I wanted you to know.
Maybe that's what I'll call it. Never mind full. I'm going to call it the reverse wear seal.
That could be the American title. We're a little less subtle.
Yes. Yeah. I like it. I'll let the publisher know that when I send it for submission to Neil Gaiman's publishing house.
Or just Neil Gaiman himself. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. That took longer than I thought. Do people want another one, or do people?
Yes.
Kind of like,
Words, obviously.
Yeah.
You
It's
sure?
not 10.
I'm extremely keen, but I've got to go to sleep because I've got to teach some children in the morning. But I'm going to listen to it.
And just tell us.
I'm going to listen to this recording. This has been beautiful. Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you so much for coming. I love
Oh my
you.
God. Am I invited back? Because that's really unclear.
Yes, obviously. And you have to come for Poetry Saturday next week and read some of
Yes, I'd love to.
Stardust starts tomorrow.
Yeah, Stardust starts tomorrow. If you would like to come, you're all welcome.
That's very tempting. I'll consider it.
Bring the
Bye.
lunch. Bye, darling.
Ooh, how do I leave? Leave.
Can't leave. Bye, Nix. Right.
So how long until you end up writing a whole story about cinnamon buns?
Don't tempt me. Well, now I'm on a roll. Now I'm on a story writing roll.
A cinnamon roll?
Mute, block, mute.
These are short stories about cinnamon buns.
I could definitely write a story about cinnamon buns. Zach, you should write a story about cinnamon buns. That's what you should do. So would people like another story?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So okay, so this is the one that I wrote this afternoon, and like had the idea for when I was out on a walk this afternoon, and then came back and wrote it. And so I've written it in, I think, literally about like 3.5 hours. I haven't even read through it again. Like I just started writing and kept writing until I got to the end, and then I came up here and got on Zoom. So the caveat, like it's not going to be like,
what you're saying is when
Frankie.
it's still really good.
Just be even more jealous of your talent.
Okay, let's see how this goes. Okay, it's longer than I was expecting. It'll be fine. Right. Okay.
Deep breath,
Frankie,
Okay.
are you sitting comfortably?
No, not even a little bit. This laptop's really like hot and heavy, and my like thighs are getting really sweaty. Everything is horrible. Right. I'm gonna mute you all. And then unmute myself. Yes. Right. Let's find it. So, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. It's called Sea Dragon. Once upon a time, there was a boy who lived by the sea. He was an unremarkable boy, not remarkably good, but not remarkably bad. He had a pleasant life, not remarkably good, but certainly not remarkably bad. He lived with his parents. The boy's father loved him very much, though he did not often tell him so. And so did his mother, though she did not always understand him. The boy loved his parents very much too, but he was also keeping something from them. It wasn't exactly a secret, but the longer and the closer he kept it, the more secret it became. The boy and his parents lived in a house on a cliff top, which hung over a small stony beach. Just realised these are both beach stories. These are probably going to be quite similar. Sorry. It wasn't a particularly pretty beach. It wasn't sandy or picturesque. It wasn't good for swimming or fishing or sailing or surfing. And the public road down to it was pitted and potholed. Hardly anyone ever went there, which suited the boy perfectly. When his secrets started to become heavier, he would take walks on the beach, kicking through the pebbles and staring out towards the horizon. One day, as he was walking along the shore, something caught his eye amongst the pebbles. A flash of blue-green, something not quite shining but luminous amongst the grey and brown stones. He bent and picked it up. It was a piece of sea glass, worn smooth and glazed by the sea like frosted moonlight. It was a couple of inches long, curving to a rounded point with a double row of bumpy serrations along the inner edge. It looked just like a tooth. The boy stood admiring it for a few moments, turning it over and over in his fingers. Then he put it in his pocket. When he got home, he put the piece of glass into a wooden box on his desk, where he kept all his most precious secrets, apart from the one he carried around with him. The next day, he was walking on the shore again, kicking morosely at the ground, when it happened again. A pale gleam of frosty colour amongst the stones. He bent and picked it up. It was another piece of glass, the same blue-green as the one from the night before. But that wasn't all. It was also the same shape, the same curve, the same bumpy serrated edge. This one was a little smaller than the other, but otherwise almost identical. The boy put this one in his pocket too and continued on, but he hadn't got more than 5 steps before he found another. This one was the same size as the first tooth. The shape was so similar to one that the boy had trouble thinking of them as anything else, but the curve bent slightly in the opposite direction, as though the two made a pair. The boy became curious. He started searching the beach methodically to see if there were any more, and sure enough, once he started looking, he seemed to find them everywhere. By the time he left the beach, he had more than 20 curving pieces of glass in slightly varying sizes. He ran home and laid them all out on his desk, arranging and rearranging them until they looked as though they were indeed a full set of curving glass fangs. The boy had been very thorough in his searching. He was certain that he had found every piece of glass on the beach, and though he still had no idea what they really were or where they'd come from, they seemed to be a complete set. He didn't expect to find anything more on the beach the next day. And yet, he hadn't gone a couple of meters before the familiar opal gleam caught his eye, in between 2 large stones that he was certain he'd looked between yesterday. It took a while for him to extract, as this one did at least seem different in shape from the tooth-shaped pieces. It was longer, a stretched helix that corkscrewed to a point. When he had finally unearthed the entire piece, it looked like nothing in the world so much as a sharp, curling horn. Baffled, the boy began to comb the beach again. Despite having definitely searched everywhere the day before, he still found more pieces. Another horn, a long glass shank that looked as though it might be a bone. Several large triangular shards that reminded him of the back of a stegosaurus. A double handful of small, differently shaped pieces of glass that might have been part of the whole, whatever the whole was, or could just be ordinary pieces of glass that might wash up on any shore. He put all of the pieces into the wooden box, which was just about large enough to fit them but was already growing full, and lay awake long into the night, puzzling over them. The boy fell into a routine. Every day he would walk on the beach, finding more pieces of the strange glass that seemed to appear overnight, no matter how many times he scoured the place, though they were still always half buried in the pebbles, as though they'd been there for a long time. Once he'd found as many as he could, he would take them back to his room and lay them out on his desk. There was no longer any room in his box of secrets, and try to work out what they could possibly be and how they might fit together. Though the beach was almost always deserted, the boy didn't have it entirely to himself. Along the cliff from his parents' house was one other, a ramshackle old place with a tin porch and leaky guttering, where lived his only neighbour. She was named Dolly. The boy had no idea how old she was. She had flyaway grey hair and wore the kind of coat he had only ever seen on old ladies, but she seemed to have enormous energy. She too combed the beach every day, generally late in the afternoon when dusk was darkening, picking up whatever she could find. Old pieces of rope, tangled fishing line, stray sandals, pieces of driftwood. He didn't know what she did with them or whether she was simply keeping the beach clean. When the boy had first started combing the beach regularly himself, Dolly had seemed most suspicious, as though she thought he were muscling in on her territory. He could see her scowling at him as he approached a clump of seaweed knotted together with faded plastic cable, poking gingerly underneath it in search of glass. But when she realised he wasn't looking for anything but glass, she relaxed. After a few days, she began greeting him with a jerk of the head that was curt but not unfriendly, and after a week or two, she actually started saying hello to him. The boy began to look forward to their sporadic meetings. He was enjoying the walks on the beach and his ongoing quest in search of the intriguing pieces of glass. They distracted him from the growing weight of his secret inside him, which was beginning to hang on him as though he'd swallowed a large stone. One day, Dolly seemed to be in an exceptionally good mood, and on seeing the boy picking his way along the shore, she actually approached him. "Now then, young man," she said brusquely, "have you found it yet, whatever it is you're looking for?" The boy, startled but pleased at being spoken to by her, slightly hesitantly showed her the pieces of glass he'd collected so far that day. Have you found anything like this here before?" Dolly gave him a sharp look. Then she chuckled. "Why don't you come and see?" And before the boy knew it, he was following her back up the narrow, winding cliff path to her tumble-down old house. She led him around the back to the yard, where all of her beachcombing prizes were stacked in orderly chaos. Piles of corrugated iron and plastic sheeting, several tyres, a railway sleeper he had no idea how she'd managed to get all the way up the cliff. She waved him over to an area with several large plastic buckets standing in rows and pulled the tarpaulin covering off them. The boy could see that one of them was absolutely full of shards of sea glass of different sizes and colours. Many were the same strange shapes and curves that he had seen in his own pieces. He reached out a hand, then hesitated. He desperately wanted to ask if he could have them, but he didn't know how Dolly would react to such a question. She was watching him sharply again, examining him so closely that for a moment he felt a stab of worry that she might be able to see his secret right there inside his body. The boy didn't know what she was looking for in his face, or what she might have found, but she gave a twisting grin and she nodded roughly at the bucket. "Go on then, take it. It's not doing me any good." His heart bounding, stammering thanks, the boy took the bucket by the handle. It was very heavy. As he turned to carry it home, he stopped. "Dolly," he asked hesitantly, "what do you think they are? Do you know where they're from?" Dolly peered down into the bucket. She picked out a piece of glass and examined it. It was another long curve, but rounder than the tooth-shaped pieces the boy had found first, thicker at the base and hooked like a talon. She gave a bark of laughter. "Damned if I know. Look like they're from a dragon, don't they?" She dropped the piece back into the bucket and shooed him away. On the slow, arduous way home, the boy pondered what she'd said. A dragon. When he reached his room, he laid a towel on his bed and tipped the bucket onto it, sorting through the pieces. There were all sorts in there, copies of ones he already had, as well as shapes that were new to him, and what seemed like hundreds of smaller, jagged diamond pieces that looked rather like scales. A dragon, he thought. A dragon. He cleared a space on the floor and began to lay out the pieces once more, moving them around and rearranging them, looking for the ways that they fit together. Now he knew what he was looking at, it was easier, arranging and assembling the glass pieces, laying them out on the floor the way he'd seen archaeologists do on television with human skeletons, leaving gaps in the places he couldn't find something that fit. Typo. The boy stayed up for hours, and when he was finished, he sat back and looked at what he'd made. There, on the floor of his room, was a dragon. Not quite a full dragon. Its hind leg was missing, as was a large section of its tail and flank, and there were nowhere near enough scales to form an entire glass hide. But still, it was a dragon, or had been, or would be. The scanty ribs of its wings spread across the full width of his floor, as if it was about to fly away. The boy felt once more the weight of his secret grow inside him. He thought that he would give anything to fly away too. The days continued to pass. Now the boy knew what he was looking for, the pieces assembled more quickly, each day's finds falling almost effortlessly into place on the increasingly complete glass dragon in his room. It looked so lifelike, though he didn't know how that was possible. There was no such thing as a real dragon. But still, it looked like a real dragon. He began to wonder what would happen once the whole dragon was complete. Was it possible? Could it be possible that it could be real once more? As soon as he'd had the thought, the boy was certain. He knew that if only he could find all of the pieces, the dragon would come alive again, would be able to fly away. He wanted that. He wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything, or almost anything. His secret still weighed within him. It was getting heavier by the day now, causing him to walk slowly, sleep badly, eat little. His parents had noticed, and he knew they were worrying about him, though they didn't seem to know how to ask what was wrong. Another week, and the skeleton was complete. 4 days and the wings were finished, stretching across his room in gleaming, moon-like splendor. The final week was all scales. It was arduous, fiddly work, and the boy found himself baffled and frustrated more than once. They ranged in size from the span of his hand to the width of his finger, and they were all different colours, blue and green and brown and yellow, and even some translucent clear glass ones. But slowly and painstakingly, the boy pieced the glass dragon's scaly hide together, and the gaps grew smaller and smaller. There was only the tail to do, then the end of the tail, then the tip of the tail. Then, finally, after struggling with one particularly small and fiddly blue-green heart-shaped piece that stubbornly refused to slot in amongst the others, the boy sat back and found that the entire dragon was complete. It was magnificent. From pale green snout to irritating tail, from wingtip to iridescent wingtip, it was perfect. But nothing happened. The dragon didn't move. The boy couldn't understand. He'd been so certain that when it was complete, the dragon would be real again, that it would be able to fly away. Angry, frustrated tears sprung to his eyes. There was nothing missing. The dragon was complete. He'd been so certain. Suddenly a thought struck him, and he almost laughed aloud with the relief of it. A heart. He hadn't found the heart yet. Of course it couldn't live without its heart. He leaped to his feet and raced out of the door, despite the gathering dark. He searched amongst the rocks along the shore, by the sea and by the cliff, looking for the glass heart. He couldn't find it. That's okay, he told himself. I've already been down here today and gathered all the glass that was here. I need to wait till tomorrow. Tomorrow will be the final piece. The next day he was down at the beach before breakfast, sprinting out of the door past his astonished mother, who hadn't seen him move so energetically in weeks. He leapt the last few steps of the cliff path onto the pebbles and looked wildly around for a pale blue-green gleam. Nothing. He raced off along the beach, casting around like a hunting dog. Still he couldn't find it. He returned, retraced his steps more slowly, methodically, trying every part of the beach. Nothing. There was no heart. There was nothing that even looked like it could be a heart. Only cold grey and brown stones and seaweed and emptiness. The boy returned to his house, all his wild energy gone. He could barely answer his mother when she asked what he'd been doing. He went up to his room and sat on the bed, staring morosely at the perfect, motionless dragon on his floor. The next day, he returned to the beach and looked once more, and the next day and the one after. Still nothing. Nothing that looked like the missing heart. He still tried, though. A few small fragments of ordinary sea glass that he had found months before. Fresh glass, a bottle taken from the recycling bin and carefully smashed to make an appropriately sized glass shard. Even a suitably heart-shaped stone he found on the edge of the sea. Nothing worked. And his own heart grew heavier within him, and the secret within it hurt him badly. A crunch of pebbles told him Dolly was approaching. He didn't want to speak to her, but couldn't bring himself to make any effort to avoid her. She stumped up, her arms clamped around a pile of assorted detritus. Now then, young man, you won't find anything staring around like a cow like that. Or have you already collected the whole dragon? She cackled. But her question, however jocular, hit the boy so hard that he flinched. To their mutual horror, he found tears beginning to slide down his face. Dolly looked startled and deeply uncomfortable. After an uneasy moment, she bent and carefully placed her ill-assorted pile on the ground, where it slowly began to collapse into a muddled heap. She patted the boy awkwardly on the shoulder. Come on now, what's all this about? No need to make a fuss, it'll be all right. Her inept kindness was the last straw. Without meaning to, the boy began to speak. The words poured out like water from a jug, unstoppable and helpless. He told her about the glass, about the dragon, about the heart. He caught himself on the verge of telling her about his secret. It was teetering on the back of his throat, but he forced it back down and blinked back his tears. What do you think? He asked Dolly, almost beyond caring how it sounded. Why do you think the heart isn't here? She stared at him for a long moment, sucking her teeth. Oh. Am I back? Sorry, my phone's dying. She stared at him for a long moment, sucking her teeth. Then she shrugged. Maybe it doesn't have one. The boy found himself caught between relief that she hadn't dismissed the whole story as insane and frustration at her lack of understanding. It has to have one. It can't have been alive without a heart. Maybe it was never alive. He was angry now, tears starting once more. Of course it was. It must have been. Everything else is there. Dolly was unperturbed. No must have been about it. Doesn't mean it might never be. Could have been waiting for someone to put it together. The boy blinked. Waiting, he said slowly. But the heart. I still don't have the heart. She shrugged again and bent to laboriously pick up her collection of beach pickings. Maybe it didn't have one. Maybe it's waiting for that too. But I tried. I tried loads of things. Other kinds of glass and a stone and... Dolly snorted. A stone? She hoisted her bundle more firmly into her arms and straightened. Listen, boy, God knows I don't know much about hearts, but one thing I do know, you can't make a heart out of a stone. You need a living heart. Even a glass heart needs to be living, eh? It was the longest statement the boy had ever heard her make. He stared at her weathered, lined old face and wondered for the first time if Dolly had secrets of her own. She shifted, awkward once more, and hoisting her pile, she began to set off up the beach, the conversation clearly at an end. The boy stood looking out over the waves, turning over her words in his mind. A living heart. A living glass heart. How could such a thing possibly be obtained? For several days he wondered. He became more distant and abstracted than ever, eating his food mechanically, responding to his parents' questions automatically and at random, not even noticing their increasing concern, their hovering about his bedroom door, their tentative inquiries. Then, finally, one night as he lay in bed watching the churning sky beyond his bedroom window, the glass dragon casting glimmering reflections on the ceiling, the grain of an idea came to him. He wasn't sure. He had no idea if it would work or even how he could make it happen, but it was the only idea he had, and he knew he had to try. He began to watch the weather, obsessively examining the forecasts. He disassembled the dragon so as to be ready as soon as the conditions were right, stacking the pieces carefully in a large suitcase. Finally, the night came. Storm clouds started amassing over the horizon as they were eating dinner, and the boy could barely choke his meal down in his excitement and anxiety. The sky continued to darken, and by midnight was a roiling mass of clouds. The boy could hear the far-off, distant rumblings of thunder. He got out of bed and dressed, his hands trembling. The suitcase was heavy and unwieldy, but he managed to maneuver it down the stairs without knocking into anything, and then he was out the front door and lugging it down the cliff path. It was a light night, despite the storm clouds, the wind whipping them in ragged streamers across the face of the moon as the boy opened the suitcase and began to lay the dragon out afresh on the sand. He worked fast, knowing it so well by now, and the glass pieces seemed to fall together almost without effort beneath his hands. The thunder was coming closer. He saw the first faint flash of lightning on the horizon. The boy knelt and scooped up a handful of the rough sand, clamping it between his palms into a rough, fist-sized lump. He held it up and looked at it. It didn't look very much like a heart, but then he supposed no heart did. His own hammered in his chest, and his secret beat alongside it, heavy and insistent and so big he felt there wasn't room for it inside him. A living heart, Dolly had said. He leaned across and carefully placed it into the center of the dragon's ribcage. Then he bent forward and brought his mouth as close as he could to the dragon's heart. He whispered his secret to it. A crash of thunder made him jump backwards. It was louder than he'd expected and closer, too close. He turned away and scrambled towards the base of the cliff, the loose shale sliding under his feet, counting frantically in his head. 3, 2. The lightning struck soundlessly. It forked down from the churning sky and hit the glass dragon square on, impossibly bright, throwing vivid purple afterimages against the cliff. Almost on instinct, he curled into a ball, shielding his head from he didn't know what, his vision crazed with dark spots. There was a sudden, intense smell of scorching. After a moment, the boy opened his eyes. He was shaking violently from head to foot. Very slowly, he turned back to face the dragon. The heart was glowing, a molten, incandescent brightness that was almost too painful to look at. It was beating. The glass dragon opened its eyes. With a noise like the finger on the rim of a wine glass, it heaved itself to its feet. For a moment it stood, staring straight at the boy with eyes that glowed and glimmered blue-green like frosted moonlight. Then it spread the shimmering curtains of its glass wings, and with a single bound it leapt into the sky. For a second it was outlined against the moon, its light reflecting through its body and casting a many-coloured dapple onto the boy where he stood craning up from the shore. Then it beat its wide wings once more and was gone. The boy stared into the sky for a long time after it had disappeared. Only when he began to feel the chill setting into his bones did he lower his gaze. He felt light, as though he were made of glass himself. The knowledge of his secret was still inside him, but its heaviness seemed to have lifted. He was about to begin the long trudge when he saw something flash and glint green on the sand. A tiny scale, the stubborn scale from the very tip of the tail that he'd had such trouble with, had been shaken loose. It lay gleaming on the sand like a discarded jewel. The boy bent and picked it up. It was no larger than his little fingernail and shaped almost exactly like a heart. He folded his fingers tight around it. The boy held on to the tiny glass scale all the way up the long cliff path to his house. As he approached, he could see that all the lights were on, His parents must have woken and realised that he was gone from his bed. He walked slowly up to the front door and opened it. His parents were in the front room. His mother looked grey and much older than he'd seen her before in her faded dressing gown. The boys stopped in the doorway as they turned to face him. He could feel the glass dragon scale pressing into the centre of his palm. Mum? Dad? There's something I need to tell you.
You can't stop there.
You wrote that in one sitting.
In 3 hours? How is that possible?
What?
Huh? Did you like it?
Fucking hell.
Yeah.
Frankie, genuinely, that's one of my favourite short stories I've heard for years. What?
He's gone. Bye, Ben.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you liked it.
Yeah.
How exciting. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, my heart's beating really fast.
That is amazing. Like, did you literally write that today?
You know, after I sent you the message saying I've had a really cute idea for a story, that wasn't this one. I was like, oh, okay, right. I had another idea for a story, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to go for a walk. I haven't like left the house in days. Need to go out. Go and have a walk and like think about this like cute story idea that I've come up with. Out on the walk, I was like walking through a field, and there was some like, you know, shards of broken glass in the field, and I saw them and thought of a different story, and then that like took over and ate my brain, and I came back and wrote
How
that.
are you so talented? It's an outrage.
It really is.
Ridiculous. Amazing.
I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Please always share your stories with us. Like, it's a gift. Thank you.
If you want to.
Oh my god, I'd love to. Why do you think I've created this space and this carefully curated selection of excellent, like amazing people, specifically so that you have to listen when I have shit to tell you?
Oh, woe to us.
Okay. Right, I'm gonna switch to the laptop from the phone so that I can look at all of your faces. Okay.
You can't have sound coming out of both at once, so it confuses it.
Oh, I thought I've got it muted.
You need to turn off the speaker as well as the microphone. You're still muted, Frankie.
We'll get there.
I knew that.
I know.
Hey, gorgeous.
Hi, sweet pea.
On a snack.
We're all just dumbstruck.
I was kind of like, it's all gone very quiet in here.
Processing.
Are you actually a published author and you've just been keeping it quiet?
Oh no! Secretly, I'm Neil Gaiman. pull my face off.
That makes sense.
Married to Amanda Palmer?
Yeah, Amanda Palmer.
Oh my god, you and Amanda Palmer, like.
Amanda.
Frankie, what did see or think of on your walk that kind of prompted this story to suddenly flood your brain?
Yeah, I saw the kind of shards of glass I was like walking through some kind of farmer's fields, and there was like a bunch of kind of broken glass just sort of in the soil, and I saw it. Oh, hold on, there's still a little bit of an echo coming. And you kind of saw it sticking out and thought that it looked like, I don't know, like fossils or something. And then I thought, what would it be of? Like if these kind of pieces of glass were the bones of something, what would it be of?
Where did the idea for the secret come from?
Oh no, am I shouting again?
No.
Oh,
okay, that's fine.
It might just be me.
Audio is strange. Gordon, damn it. Yeah, Gordon, it is you.
All right.
Sorry.
I don't know. I think I knew that I wanted it to be that the dragon needed like a living heart for it to kind of become a thing. And so I thought, well, how do you give it a living heart? And then I thought about the lightning, about it having like a molten heart from a kind of lightning strike on sand, but then that didn't seem kind of enough. And so I thought, well, he's got to give it something of his own.
Something alive, something that makes you alive in secrets.
Yeah, and then it was like
very alive.
Yeah, like the kind of, I like the idea that it's a dragon and he kind of wants it to be able to fly away because he wants to fly away. I don't know, it's the kind of thing that like you listen to it and you kind of go, oh yeah, that sounds kind of meaningful, but it has not been constructed in any meaningful way. Thank God the author.
At least you're not Mary Shelley and just putting someone else's heart in there.
Yeah, exactly.
I have thoughts and comments, but it's still recording.
Go for it, Gordon. What's that,
Em? I was just saying that's the beauty of it, that you've managed to create this in such a meaningful seeming way, even if it just kind of came out of your brain, and that's what it was. Like you've created the kind of layers that we want to go back to and read again to look for more meaning in. And that is an art.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
And I have to say, there's something lovely about having a story read to you by its original author and then being able to have a Q&A with the author.
Yeah.
Yeah, even if your questions are mostly like, what does this mean? And I'm like, it doesn't really mean anything. I just made it up, put it in there because it sounded good.
I can totally put you in touch with someone who will talk your ear off about self-publishing.
Interesting. Oh yeah.
Also,
I do like the idea. Hi Malcolm. Hi sweetie. When did you go?
I've just been listening.
Oh, that's lovely to have you along. Yeah, I applied for the Northern Writers Awards this year with a couple of stories, with the one that I wrote for Touch that I wrote for Peter, and then the mermaid story that I think Malcolm's heard and you've heard, Charlotte. So yeah, I submitted those two for the Northern Writers Awards because they were the only two stories that I had complete.
Of all the stories of yours I've heard, they have all taken place on a beach, which I love. I think you should only ever write any more stories that happen on a beach.
I have my wheelhouse, and I'm staying in it.
How did the Northern Writers thing go? How did the Northern Writers thing go?
I mean, I assume that everything is on hiatus till, so they wouldn't have kind of announced it until June anyway, and I'm kind of assuming that all bets are off until life is normal again.
Stay at home and read stories.
Yes. So maybe they'll
At
announce
least
it
the
early.
book award that I'm making trophies for is still running at the same time.
Yeah?
Yeah. So they might still announce the same schedule that they used to be, or that you were expecting.
That's cool. Yeah, that's very cool. I mean, I've never kind of entered anything like that before, and like I have absolutely no idea what the chances are of me even kind of hearing back about it.
The high.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, hold on, I realised I'm still recording.